Welcome back to Global Crossroads. I'm your host, Bryan Hull. In past Global Crossroads, we've had local guests, either from PCC or sometimes people who are living in the Portland area working at PSU. But today we've gone a little bit more further afield than usual. Our guest today is from UC Riverside. Professor Muhamad Ali. He teaches in the Department of Religion, and he is an Islamic scholar. Welcome.
Thank you.
To Portland. He was just saying it was looking very beautiful out. It's sunny today.
It's sunny today.
Just for you.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start with your insight. It's just your perspective on this, but I don't think we get to hear nearly enough different perspectives in these discussions that we have. And so with the most recent anti-Islamic film that was made in California and the reaction worldwide, as an American watching the news, it wasn't clear to me what the general reaction was for Muslims worldwide. I couldn't tell if there was a small group of people who were very upset, but most people were like, eh. Or if it was general, if it was more than just a small group of people, if this was very upsetting on a large scale.
There was some, general, resentments against the film, but they go differently, they go to different ways for protesting that. So there's a very small number of Muslims in different places in the Middle East and in Indonesia, in Asia, in some part of Europe also, really, rarely on the street, go into the street and do something. Very, very small number of them. But they use now social media most of the time. Most Muslims now use social media to really, say something about it. They never. For example, in Indonesia, you cannot really see YouTube, for example, but they know it from the news, from the TV and so they know. So they never really watch the video.
Right.
So
like most people.
Most people, right? Never really watch the film. So they just know that it is an anti-Islamic film or video, done in America by Christian, and then you have a Coptic Christian. You have some before even make a point that this is a Jewish, conspiracy.
That was the first
That's
idea,
right. So that's every time news say something and they really react to that. But this is quite widespread in terms of reactions in words and through social media, but
so
not so much.
Give me an example of what people would be saying over social media about the incident. Would they be blogging? Would they sending tweets to people? What would people be doing?
They, for example, write statuses, Facebook statuses, right? So they, Facebooks and Twitters also, they tweet.
Saying what their feelings, their
that's
thoughts
right,
are.
their feelings, for example. So, for example, what they say in a tweet, for example, the U.S. has not done enough to really, punish the person, that kind of thing. And when they know that he's in jail, for example, they said, well, it's not for the film, it's because of something else, which is, identity, fraud or something. It's not because of his insult of Prophet Muhammad and Islam, for example, in the film. So they still are critical of the fact that he's in jail now. That's some of the voices that you can see in the tweets, for example.
That's very helpful, because you don't hear about that
right.
People are responding in that way.
Right. And some government leaders also do that. I mean, they raise the voice about this. What is really religious freedom? What is the freedom of religion, for example? Why United States is so exceptional or unique in this case? For example, why not punishing this for example. So that's kind of things, you know, the criticisms of hypocrisy, of you know, double standard of doing this.
So, given that you've lived in the U.S. for a while, how do you respond to people in Indonesia, for example, who may be asking you, why is this possible? What do you say to them?
First of all, you've got to understand American history and culture. So, and I tell them, they ask me, and I tell them that, you know, it is important to understand other cultures, and the, you know, and the constitutions and so forth and so on. So I see many Muslims in many parts in the Middle East and Asia. They actually love freedom and democracy. They love freedom in principle, but they know nothing about how this freedom and democracy is really operating. How this democracy and freedom really operates in through laws, in the day-to-day life,
ugly sometimes,
right,
messy
exactly
way. Yeah.
So they hope it's they always imagine that democracy is just, you know, like a peaceful, beautiful, that everyone agree on everything, right? Right. So when, for example, there's some voices against or attacking, you know, Prophet Muhammad or Islam or things like that, they was why you know, they don't see that as a democracy. That's
not a
that's not a democracy.
Ah.
So for them, democracy has to also protect the faith and, you know, religion of the people, especially belief that they've really hold very, very dearly. So it's quite interesting, you know. And then I'll tell them about, you know, how American history is quite different, for example, from European history, where you have other concept of freedom, for example.
Right.
And some of them would accept that explanation, but some of them no. Still, you know, religious freedom has limits. Democracy has to be in a certain way that everyone has to be taken into account and you know, respected. So they want respect, and they want that nobody, even within a democracy, denigrate, you know, their faith and their prophet. So
I'm just going to jump around because it's very unique opportunity to have someone like you at PCC. So as it may not surprise you, I don't speak Arabic, and I've only read the Quran in English. And when I read in English, it felt, you know, sometimes you read things in English and you say, this doesn't seem to quite capture it, you know. Some things, like if you read Russian classics, I feel like I'm getting the sense of 19th century Russia, you know. But when I read the Quran in English, I was like, well, because I've had friends who said, oh, it's a very poetic book. But when I read in English, it doesn't really come across as very poetic. So do you think that an English-speaking person reading the book is missing out on a lot?
Well, first of all, Muslims would say that the Quran is always in Arabic,
right?
And secondly, it is only a translation; it's not considered the Quran itself. So they don't really bother if, for example, any translation is not poetic enough or not, you know, touching or.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
So, I would say there's some part of that, you know, some part of this nuance and feeling that you cannot really get by, you know, reading the translation. You really got to read it in Arabic, because you have, for example, let's say, Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid walam yulad, walam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad, right? So you had, right?
Nice rhyming.
That's right, nice rhyming, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have that in English translation, right? So that's kind of thing. So even though Muslims read the Quran, they don't necessarily understand the meanings, but they can feel it, they can sense this is, you know, this is poetic, and even though they don't consider that as poem, but it is poetic. That's one part of the language thing.
So the rhyming, is there also, you know, in poems there are often metaphors and symbols, things function on multiple levels at the same time. Is that as well? Do you get that?
That's right. You get that in Arabic. So, you know, as for example, the image of paradise, for example, right? So it's very clear that it's not only so much about the image itself, but the way it is worded. You know, it's quite powerful for those who could understand Arabic. So images of paradise or even images of hell, for example, that in the Quran, it's you cannot just read the meaning of it, but also the rhymes and the word itself.
Interesting. It almost makes me want to take Arabic, but it's a very hard language,
Yeah.
Did you learn it as you were
Right,
growing up?
right when I was in a still elementary school. Well, my parents taught me also some Arabic.
Yeah.
My mom and so, right. So.
Yeah. Okay. So when I was I had a guy who was showing me around a city in Morocco, and he said at the very beginning, no taboos. We should be able to talk about anything. And I was like, okay,
That's good.
no taboos. I agree. And he stuck to it. I was very impressed. Anything I asked, he would answer in the most honest, straightforward way. So in his spirit, because I really appreciated that, I'm going to ask a question that I think a lot of Americans ask in their heads, but they're afraid to sort of say it. I think what happens is a lot of Americans read the paper and they see constantly Muslim names with acts of violence. And I think it's very difficult for them to separate the religion and the culture from the violence. And so I'm wondering, you have had a million conversations where you either have directly or indirectly addressed this. And I wonder what's the most effective thing that you have found in helping people separate out the violence from the religious tradition?
First, understand the Quran as the source that they use, all Muslims, in context. So, as any scripture or any book, you cannot read without understanding the context. Understanding the context of the Quran, it's a 7th century text, right? So that you really understand the context of the time. So you have some exclusive and also inclusive verses of the Quran.
What does that mean? Inclusive and exclusive?
Right? Exclusive verse of the Quran is, verses, the passage of the Quran. They say, Islam is the way of life. Your way of life is, the religion of God, and you have to preach it, and so forth and so on. So exclusive, right? So suggesting that Islam is the best for you, right? But on the other hand, you also have inclusive passage of the Quran. For example, that God would not make this community one. He wanted diverse, right? You have that, for example.
I remember that passage,
and also, for example, God created human beings into men and women, and also into tribes and nations, different colors, different languages, for example, in order they may know each other. For example, the notion of knowing each other is part of this inclusive passage of the Quran. So understand that first, right? Context of the Quran, you have these different. The second thing is that you need to also differentiate religion from culture. Distinguish religion and culture. Arabic culture doesn't mean it's an Islamic culture. So Islam and Arab are not identical. For example,
in advertising your event, I said I think people, when they think of Islam, they think they've conflate the Middle East with Islam.
Only 20%. Only 20% Muslims today live in Arabic countries. Only 20%. Most Muslims now live in either Asia or Africa, and they don't speak Arabic, but they embrace Islam. They learn Arabic, but they are not necessarily speaking Arabic.
So that is a very important.
That's the second one, right? So differentiate Arabic and Islam. The third one, I would say, politics, the rule of politics. So when they are violent, most of the time, they are concerned about the politics, not about the culture of America, not about principles of democracy or freedom of America or the West. They are not necessarily against the West as such. They are they are rejecting one, hypocrisy of the West, right? Which is a double standard in the Middle East. One. Second, they don't truly practice freedom and democracy for everyone. So they only apply democracy or freedom only for themselves, not for the other. in this case is Muslim. So they feel, unrespected or not respected enough to say. So that politics, foreign policy, for example, that they are concerned about, not American culture, not American democracy, not American freedom, not technology, not globalization, not modernity. They love that. They embrace that. Everyone, even the Islamists, actually embrace modernity. They use cell phone, they use TV, they use social media, they use all this technology.
So I want to go back to the very first, you gave us 3 points. I want to go back to this idea of inclusive verses and exclusive verses.
Right.
So I'm teaching right now world literature. And in teaching world literature, I see students wrestle with ways of thinking that are different than American ways of thinking. So if they're given a poem, they try to understand that poem, even though the poem is written in 13th century Turkey.
Right.
They try to understand it using American way of thinking. And this is a very important thing. What they do is, if in the poem 2 opposing ideas are placed in the poem,
Right.
they try to figure out which one is the right one. Like, the poet really thinks this is the one that the poem is celebrating, and this one, they either ignore it or they say that one. And so I think different cultures deal with this this polarity
Right.
in different ways. And so you have inclusive verses and exclusive verses. And I noticed when I read the Quran, the thing that freaked me out the most is God was forgiving and God was punishing.
Right.
Over and over and over
That's
again.
correct.
And I was like, how can God be both forgiving
Right.
and punishing at the same time? Because
Right.
it seems if you're forgiving, then you're not going to punish.
Right.
So how, in your study, is Islamic studies, how do you think those 2 different things should be thought of?
First, understanding the context of each, right? So the Quran was for 23 years, right? In Mecca and Medina. The first one in Mecca, the first passage, and the second one is Medina. Different context, different political situation, different religious composition. For example, in Medina you had Jews, right? In Mecca you don't have Jews, for example. So
Wait a second, you're going fast. Where do you have Jews? In which
just
one?
in Medina. In Medina.
In Medina, okay.
Right. So that's why, part of the Quran, when they talk or address Jews, were actually in Medina, and as a response to Muslims, new community of Muslims in relation to the Jews at the time. So you have, for example, passage of the Quran say, you have to follow the law of Moses, for example. You actually, don't really practice, the Torah, for example. So the Quran is critical of what they're doing, not critical of Torah itself. The Quran is not critical of, for example, Injil or Evangel or the Bible, Old Testament.
So you have the Mecca and the Medina sections.
Right.
And so how's the reader to resolve them? 2 different contexts, but then...
Understand, for example, the first city talks about one God and the Day of Judgment. This one is about social and political aspect. So this one, in a way, is more universal. Political. That's right. Social and political is in the second passage, and the first one is belief. Just believe oneness of God. That God is one, and believe in the hereafter. That's it. So the message of the Mecca period is only believing in God and hereafter. You don't really pray, for example, in Mecca. You don't fast. You don't do pilgrimage. You don't have a notion about jihad, for example, in the city of Mecca. Only until in the city of Medina that you have a jihad, which means not struggle. It's struggle, not holy war.
So I just want to make sure I get this straight. Medina is the social political city? Okay.
That's correct.
This is very helpful. I don't know if anyone who's listening will find it helpful, but you're helping me a lot in my teaching. So thank you. So this gets me to a topic that I wonder how you handle. I've made it sort of a personal political thing that I will both question, whenever I hear anything that's anti-Islamic, I will in some way, directly or indirectly, find a way to question it. But at the same time, if I'm in a Muslim context and I hear anything that's anti-Jewish, I will also question that. And it's, How do you handle that? If when you're in circles and you hear something, you're
Right.
like, they seem to be confusing Israelis with Jewish
Right,
tradition.
right.
What do you say? Like, how do you bring people's attention to that?
One, distinguishing, right? Try to distinguish many different terms and labels, right? For example, Judaism, Jews, the state of Israel, children of Israel are quite different things. That's one. So you hear a lot conflation of all of this, right?
Right.
Okay, so first of all, distinguishing all of this, they try to understand the origin of the term and how this is used in the Quran, how it is used in the history of Islam, and so that's one. Distinguishing this Israel, Judaism, Jews, and so. For example, the Quran itself actually mentioned that not all Jews are the same. For example, that that they actually are children of God, and one chapter of the Quran we talk about Jews not necessarily in a negative way. For example, really just talk about Jews. There are also some rabbis, many rabbis who actually follow the Torah and so forth. This is what is missing in many of the discourse among Muslims themselves. They emphasize the exclusive part of it that I talk about, right? That, for example, Jews and Christians would not be pleased with Muslims until they follow their religion, for example. This is one of the verses that they always emphasize, but they miss other passages of the Quran.
Right.
For
Yeah,
example,
I
that's
noticed
one.
when in all interviews, I mean, you're like, this is what's very unique and unusual about this discussion is in most interviews I hear, either the speaker, the guest will either emphasize the inclusive parts of the Quran or they will emphasize the exclusive parts.
Right.
And because I've read it once in English, I can
Right.
say, well, they're really ignoring this part of it. And
That's
so it
right.
always feels very unsatisfactory.
That's right. You have to talk all of them. You cannot just ignore part of it and to emphasize the other side. So you have to tell them that this is a text, and text always contradiction. There is always a contradiction in any text.
Right.
So, and this is within the cultural context and socio-political context. It is possible. It just makes sense. It makes sense that text is contradiction, has a contradiction. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have a value in in guiding people, because guide can be so you don't have, for example, one book telling you doing one thing in one time. It is about different things. Right? It's about, maybe one is about family, the other one about, your personal life, the other one about social relations, the other one about, all different things. You cannot do just one text, like a guide for every situation.
I have had students in my office say there are no contradictions in the Quran.
You have that verse of the Quran, but doesn't mean that it is, you do have contradiction in the Quran. So I say it then because I know that. And contradictions.
Right, and why are they saying this to me? I mean,
because
for me, I wouldn't care if there was contradiction.
Right, because they believe that God, the Quran is God's word, literal word of God, literal word of God. That it is impossible to have a contradiction in a sacred book, right?
In their minds.
In their mind, right? But if you learn the Quran historically and literally, you can see some contradiction. Well, Muslim scholars themselves realize that. That's why they try to reconcile this. First, abrogation, the notion of abrogation. So the verses that come after abrogated the verses before.
Uh-oh.
Okay?
Okay, wait, that's a hard concept. So first obligations, and
abrogation.
And what's the relationship between obligations and what comes before?
Right, they replace or change or abrogate the verses before. So because it comes later, so it abrogate. So for example,
so it's a process.
That's right. It's a gradual one.
You cancel out what comes before you.
That's correct. That's abrogation. It's called nasakh in Arabic.
Oh, okay.
So that's one.
And this is why I've often heard that a community leader can make a new statement if there's consensus in the community in Islam.
What do you mean?
That it's not a static thing, that there can still be new rulings that change the tradition. Is this true?
You have religious authority, but this religious authority called ulama or mullah actually less important now because of the media. You have more diversification of religious authority. Muslims can just go to the internet and go to computers or books and then they can try to answer the question by themselves. So you have the pluralization of Islamic authority. So you do have some establishment who try to tell you about what to do, but people, Muslims, don't necessarily listen to them. They listen to them when they feel they agree with them, but not necessarily. So it's
to
very
deal
liberal.
with this, you have to think of it in a sequence, like, so this statement is in response to this statement, and you have to know which came first.
That's right. Which now comes first, and secondly, you have verses are related to each other. There's a theme that you can see in the Quran. So that's why most Muslims would say the Quran is actually consistent in that sense, not contradiction in that sense. Maybe the word contradiction, most Muslims would disagree, right? So contradiction.
But that's another way it's poetic, because with poems there's a theme and things change, but there's a constant that holds the poem together.
Right. So constant change and dynamics, and it's a response. The Quran is a response to changing situation.
So the whole text is in response to something else.
The whole Quran and the Hadith and all the books about Islam actually a response to the changing situations. And Islam and the Quran also allows change of law, for example, because of changing situations.
So I'm wondering, if you don't have titles off the top of your head, that's fine. But it seems like we have a very short time to talk. If students or instructors were interested in reading more, what do you say are 2 fairly accessible books that they might consult?
One, Introduction to Islam by Frederick Denny.
Wait a second. Introduction to Islam by who?
Frederick Denny.
How do you spell that last name?
Frederick Denny. Last name E-N-N-Y.
N-N-Y, okay.
D-N-N-Y. That's one. Second one is Straight Path by John Esposito. The Straight Path.
The Straight Path?
John Esposito.
Yes, I've seen that one. That's good, huh?
Yeah, so it's quite good. I mean, it gives you some diversity.
Both of these books will talk about some of the issues that you're talking about?
Right, this one, yes. You have a historically Introduction to Islam, talks about, historical aspect of Islam, the diversity of Islam, understanding the context of the Quran, the context of relationship between Muslim and Jews and Christian, for example. It's quite an, important book. It is the introduction. It's accessible to students, this one. Okay. Second one is more,
Do you use this one in your classes?
Yes, I use this for my intro to Asian religion, also Islam courses. There are some other books. You have 20 of them, but this is one of these.
Maybe I'll, if you can send them to me, I'll post them on the page that talks about you coming to PCC.
Right.
I feel like we could talk for hours and hours and hours and hours. No one would be watching at some point, but I feel like we just started to get, and I had so many other questions that we didn't even get to, but that's because it got very interesting. And you've thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me
with me about these very, very important, relevant, essential. Hopefully, it's been very educational to the PCC audience.
Thank you.
And thank you. Hopefully, you've learned something. If you're interested in those titles and you couldn't quite write them down, I will try to post a list of books on Professor Ali's page on the Internationalization Initiative. Until next time, thank you for watching Global Crossroads. Good job.
Thank you.